And so the grapes are, we have our team of pickers that are picking and carrying the grapes down the slopes to the bottom. And then I'm here usually at the bottom of the slopes here with our boxes. The grapes are put into a big, which is they dump the grapes in the buckets into a guy, carries them on his backpack, a big, huge pack, and then goes down and dumps the grapes into our boxes. And then we load our truck down there and drive it back to the vineyard. So to pick this parcel, it takes us half a day to pick it. And then we get the grapes back to the winery and start the winemaking process. And so pretty much all the reds are made the same way. It depends on the vintage, though. Some vintages are, when they're, depends on the ripeness and the season, whether we do how much whole cluster fermentation we do versus destemmed and partially crushed fermentation. But in the 17, it was about 80% whole berry fermentation, whole cluster fermentation, and the other 20% was destemmed and lightly crushed. So we mix that into the tank. And the whole berry, whole cluster fermentation is a very slow process, similar to, it's also the same thing that we do with.
There's a drone. We're being filmed.
No, it's not a drone.
Oh, it's not a drone?
No, anyway.
What is that?
Oh,
it's a hang glider.
It's a motorized glider coming overhead. This is great. You can see all.
Life in Burgundy.
Actually, do you want to try to catch them?
It's grass there.
Can you see that? Let's see. I don't know if you can see that.
Well, he sees us, so that's all that matters. We're pretty much alone, except everybody doing their extracurricular activities.
All right. So the Pommard is basically, as I said, the whole clusters go into the tank, and since there's not a lot of juice, we do a lot of pump overs, and we do a lot of punch downs and try to free up the juice. But again, it's a slower fermentation to get the juice free and get the fermentation going. And then throughout the whole fermentation, there's still a lot of whole clusters that haven't broken open. So as they open up and the juice comes out, it extends the fermentation process. Again, like I mentioned with the yeast, it's also with the red grapes that it's a longer process. So, a whole cluster fermentation can last a lot longer than something that's destemmed and crushed. So the fermentation and aging in the tank before it's pressed can last easily a month. It depends on the vintage. And then it's put into the press, and we press it off the finished wine, and then it's put in barrels for anywhere from 1.5 years on up almost to 2 years. Depends on the vintage. 17 was a nice vintage. It was a good vintage. Again, with the climate change, everything is ripening earlier and earlier. These vines here, basically where we're a month away from harvest. Again, in the end of August. And it used to be that this vineyard traditionally was harvested towards the end of September. And now, out of the last 5 or 6 years, almost all the harvests have started before the 10th of September. So everything's coming earlier. It's hotter and drier here. And so the grapes are getting really ripe, and it's been very dry here. There hasn't been any rain at all, well, since I've been here. And you can really see the grapes are starting to stress a little bit. I think it's slowing, the lack of rain is slowing things down a little bit. But the Vignots is known more, it's more of an elegant Pinot Noir. Aromatically, I love the aromatics in this wine. The little red fruit notes and get some nice cassis. Also, I get a lot of spice and floral. It's very complex aromatically, but on the palate, it has some tannins. It has nice tannins. It's 2017, but it's not overly tannic. Like the Vomorien we have on the other side is a little more tannic. This got a little softer, very mature, very ripe tannins, but softer tannins. And so it's not too astringent at a young age. But I love the soft, elegant style of it on the palate. It's really round and it lingers nicely. And the oak on this is there. It's a young wine. It has about 50% new oak in the blend. And you can get it now while, you know, pick up the oak impact of it now, but over time that will integrate and dissipate into the wine. Wow, I get almost like a Kirsch characteristic, cherry notes, almost like a Kirschwasser kind of alcohol, but cherry. And the oak is really, it's in the background. You get a little bit of that toasted oak in the background, but it really marries well with the fruit. I hope you can pick up the length on the back end of the palate. Again, some of the nice red fruits up front. And then it just seems to kind of really just linger on the back and kind of coats the palate. It really has a nice, you know, it's not a heavy, very concentrated Pommard. 17 wasn't, it was a very good vintage. It wasn't like, I think 18 and 19, we have a lot more depth and concentration and tannin, but this is a real nice vintage that you can actually get into a little bit earlier, a little bit sooner. Any questions?
Michael, it actually reminds me a lot of a Virginia Cabernet Franc.
Cabernet Franc? Is that what I heard?
Yes, Cab Franc. Yes, it reminds me of a Cab Franc.
Yeah, stylistically, it has that kind of, you know, Cab Franc's not, you know, it can be tannic, but it has more of that, the same fruit notes. I think in terms of weight and style, I can see that definitely.
It's lovely. It'll pair well with the lamb pasta we're going to have tonight. So thank you very much.
That sounds great.
What are we having tonight?
Any other?
Thank you so much for hosting this. It's the closest we're going to get to France tonight. I don't know if anybody else is having this moment, but your background is so beautiful. It almost looks like it's fake right now.
Green screen.
But I was curious, you know, Virginia was certainly not without its challenges in the last couple of vintages. What, if any, challenges have you experienced there in the vineyards in France?
Oh, we've been pretty lucky the last few vintages in terms of during the growing season. Hail has been really a big problem, though, you know, touche bois. Hopefully, this year we haven't had any problems, but hail has always been the big problem here during the growing season. But frost has been a major issue. And 17, actually, this vintage was a frost vintage where there was a lighter crop, and we did have some little pockets of frost here and there. But now with the climate change, things are starting earlier and earlier. It was a very warm winter here, and everything came out a couple of weeks ahead of schedule. And then you always have those frost risks in April, and that's been getting worse and worse here because things are starting earlier and earlier, and then you still have the cold night. So frost is the biggest challenge here. And then you know, rain at harvest is always a possibility here, but and other than that, it's more there's not so much disease, but it can get some odium and mildew and other issues in the vineyard that you got to keep an eye on. So there's definitely, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. Burgundy is, you know, is the most northern, you know, wine production. So to get, you know, Pinot Noir used to be very, you know, challenging to get it really, really ripe. Now it's you know, lately in the past 5 years, it's been incredibly easy to get super ripe vintages here. So I've seen more impact of climate change here than Virginia for sure. Really have. So.
Would you recommend letting this one lay down for 5 years or so?
Yeah, I definitely would. Definitely. I think this just arrived in the US a couple months ago. So for me, it's still kind of going through the whole shock process of being shipped. I think it's going to change a lot in the next 5 years. I think you'll start to see it fill in, round out a little bit more. Right now, the aromatics are really leading the way on this wine, but I think the palate's going to really, and even let this, if you can't drink it all tonight, let it sit for another day or two, and I think you'll see it change and open up a little bit more. So. Any other questions?
So first thing I'll say is Holly and I are at
Avon Street.
Yeah, Avon Street. So Michael's not standing in front of a green screen. That is the real background. Second, I got to ask, how difficult was it to purchase that property that you're standing on? I imagine there was some challenges there.
Yeah, it wasn't in Burgundy. It's really it's who you know. That's what it is. And the story behind this purchase is, so we have a gentleman that farms this for us. He's been renting these vineyards, all the vineyards that we bought. He was renting and farming it for a family that was not in the wine business. And as it turns out, Gaetan, who works for me, who helps me, he's a wine broker here, but he's been with me working part-time for the last 8 years. He knows everybody, and he's got to have somebody here who knows everybody. Now I actually have 2 people who know everybody, but Gaetan knew that we would love to have our opportunity to buy some vineyards, and it turns out that his hunting buddy family owned this property. And it also turns out that the farmer who's here, who farms it for us, would take the grapes, turn into bulk wine, and Gaetan would be the one who'd broker and sell to other wineries as finished wine. So Gaetan was kind of linked to both the owner and the farmer here, and he also works for me. And so he said, "Hey, I got the the reason. Here's the interesting part was that the people who were selling it didn't want the farmer to lose his job because he's about, like, in 5 years, he's retiring. So he was about 7 years or so, 8 years from retiring. And the owners didn't want to sell it to a big company, and they would replace him with their own people. So they were looking for someone to buy it who would still need them here. Unless, me being in Virginia, I'd love to be farming this. Maybe in 5 years I will be, but, so we heard about the opportunity, and we had to keep it on the down low, because if any of the other big wineries here heard about it, they'd be calling the owners and trying to outbid us and try to, the price. We actually got a really great price for what it's versus what it could have sold for, just because we kept the guy in place. And that was the beginning of it. The whole process took over a year, because you can't just buy vineyards here. It has to be approved by a local committee that approves all land transactions, all vineyard transactions. And since I won't say anything about that committee since this is being recorded, but it's not easy. It's not easy. They have a lot of people slipping money in their back pockets, if you know what I mean. And so we were nervous about it. So we actually gave Terry, the farmer, 1% ownership in the vineyard group. So we had a French owner, and he was a farmer. So we get approved by the governing board. And so we did get approved, and we were able to buy it. So we have a group of investors that it's not just me, it's 3 other people that are involved in this purchase. And so yeah, that's the story. It's a matter of just having the connections, because they're not planting any more vineyards here. They're not expanding the vineyards in Burgundy. What's here is here, and these vineyards the wines from these vineyards are sought after for all over the world, and there's all these big companies, the big negociants, will scoop up every vineyard they can if they're able to. So we're pretty lucky.